Hello, everybody, and happy birthday to Charles Dickens. Today on February 7th, he was born in 1812. So if he were still alive, he would have a pretty good age. Today, we are going to be covering the fourth installment of Dickens's David Copperfield, which is chapters 10 to 12. The chapter titles of this installment: Chapter 10, I Become Neglected and Am Provided For, gives us quite a bit of passivity. Chapter 11, I Begin Life on My Own Account and Don't Like It, give us a sense of Copperfield developing a personality. And then chapter 12, Liking Life on My Own Account No Better, I Form a Great Resolution. That idea of forming a resolution is also about kind of developing and forming his character. And that decision, which is to run away from London, will be crucial to the development of the rest of the novel. Topics that I'll cover today are working class courtship and humor, Dickens's technique of tonal shifting, imagery of lions, repetition, the setting, how Dickens crafts the setting of the warehouse, a few references to the Empire, a historical allusion, the gunpowder plot, a question around the character of Mr. Micawber, can language be a character? I'll discuss the autobiographical fragment, and then I'll kind of end with looking at a brief passage about the anxiety of biography and autobiography, and then finally a big piece of Dickensiana this week. So one of the developing courtships that's been happening in the background is that of Mr. Barcus and Clara Peggotty. So this has been kind of brewing a little bit with young David not understanding what Barcus was implying when he was saying Barcus is willing. And part of the humor generates from one, young David not recognizing what's the larger kind of implications of what's going on around him, but then also watching two lower class people undergo a courtship. Again, this is being placed in strong contradistinction to Mrs. Murdstone and Mr. Murdstone. On the very evening after our arrival, Mr. Barcus appeared in an exceedingly vacant and awkward condition, and with a bundle of oranges tied up in a handkerchief. As he made no allusion of any kind to this property, he was supposed to have left it behind him by accident when he went away, until Ham, running after him to restore it, came back with the information that it was intended for Peggotty. After that occasion, he appeared every evening at exactly the same hour, and always with a little bundle, to which he never alluded, and which he regularly put behind the door and left there. These offerings of affection were of a most various and eccentric description. Among them, I remember a double set of pig's trotters, a huge pincushion, half a bushel or so of apples, a pair of jet earrings, some Spanish onions, a box of dominoes, a canary bird in cage, and a leg of pickled pork. Mr. Barcus's wooing, as I remember it, was altogether of a peculiar kind. He very seldom said anything and would sit by the fire in much the same attitude as he sat in his cart, and stare heavily at Peggotty, who was opposite. One night being, as I suppose, inspired by love, he made a dart at the bit of wax candle she kept for her thread, and put it in his waistcoat pocket and carried it off. After that, his great delight was to produce it when it was wanted, sticking to the lining of his pocket in a partially melted state, and pocket it again when it was done with. He seemed to enjoy himself very much, and not to feel at all called upon to talk. Even when he took Peggotty out for a walk on the flats, he had no uneasiness on that head, I believe, contenting himself with now and then asking her if she was pretty comfortable. And I remember that sometimes after he was gone, Peggotty would throw her apron over her face and laugh for half an hour. Indeed, we were all more or less amused, except the miserable Mrs. Gummidge, whose courtship would appear to have been of an exact parallel nature. She was so continually reminded by these transactions of the old one. So a few things: the humor generated from the kind of random selection of objects might imply that these are things that have been left behind in Barcus's cart that he is then giving. So kind of random are they? And then his silence is also meant to generate some humor. But largely what we're seeing is the difference between the willingness on all the parts, the joy, the pleasure, even if it is silent, that everybody is taking, which so strongly sets off Clara Murdstone's experience with Mr. Murdstone. Here is the accompanying illustration, and you notice just how happy Peggotty, Ham are. Mr. Barcus, Peggotty turning away her face. Here's David and little Emily. Even the horse seems to have a smile, and Mrs. Gummidge has the shoe ready to throw. Here we're going to look at a Dickensian technique of a tonal shift. So chapter 10 is quite striking in that it contains actually two major developments. We have the marriage setting up this high humor, and then we shift to how terrible things are for young David. I felt the truth and constancy of my dear old nurse with all my heart and thanked her as well as I could. That was not very well, for she spoke to me thus, with her arms around my neck in the morning, and I was going home in the morning, and I went home in the morning with herself and Mr. Barcus in the cart. They left me at the gate, not easily or lightly, and it was a strange sight to me to see the cart go on, taking Peggotty away, leaving me under the old elm trees looking at the house, in which there was no face to look on mine with love or liking any more. And now I fall into a state of neglect, which I cannot look back upon without compassion. I fell at once into a solitary condition, apart from all friendly notice, apart from the society of all other boys my own age, apart from all companionship but my own spiritless thoughts, which seems to cast its gloom upon this paper as I write. What would I have given to have been sent to the hardest school that ever was kept, to have been taught something, anyhow, anywhere? No such hope dawned upon me. They disliked me, and they sullenly, sternly, steadily overlooked me. I think Mr. Murdstone's means were straitened at about this time, but it is little to the purpose. He could not bear me, and in putting me from him as he tried, as I believe, to put away the notion that I had any claim upon him, and succeeded. I was not actively ill-used, I was not beaten nor starved, but the wrong that was done to me had no intervals of relenting, and was done in a systematic, passionless manner. Day after day, week after week, month after month, I was coldly neglected. So some wonderful things here, right? The way in which this first paragraph on the screen moves from being together, full-heartedness, to the distancing. We have that repetition of in the morning, in the morning, in the morning, with those tense changes. I was going home in the morning. I went home in the morning. That finality, being left at the gate, and then these additional clauses that all build up to isolate David away from them, almost as the cart is moving away, kind of mimetic there. And then Dickens uses these dashes to further set young David apart. Again, we have that triple repetition, apart, apart, apart. And we have young David moved apart from older David, even as the memory comes up stronger. Notice a little bit of alliteration here as well. They disliked me, sullenly, sternly, steadily overlooked me. The K of overlooked and liked, contrasting so strongly, and those sibilants of the S's inside of there, acting as kind of aggressive language that repeatedly pounds into young Copperfield. So now I want to just look at two quotes about a lion in chapter 10. On the screen also is Dickens's own book plate. So in chapter 10, Mr. Peggotty comes and visits, and Copperfield celebrates his character. "Yes, that's just his character," said I. "He's as brave as a lion, and you can't think how frank he is, Mr. Peggotty." And then later on, David goes and stays with the Peggottys in Yarmouth. It was a night tide, and soon after we went to bed, Mr. Peggotty and Ham went out to fish. I felt very brave at being left alone in the solitary house, the protector of Emily and Mrs. Gummidge, and only wished that a lion or a serpent or any ill-disposed monster would make an attack upon us, that I might destroy him and cover myself with glory. But as nothing of the sort happened to be walking about on Yarmouth Flats that night, I provided the best substitute I could by dreaming of dragons until morning. So just kind of laying out, maybe we should question some of the idolation of Steerforth. Is Steerforth a lion? Is young Copperfield making a maybe more profound connection by calling Steerforth a lion and later saying he wanted to fight lions? Who knows? Stick around and find out. And then we also have these questions of heroism, right? If you'll remember from back to the opening line of the novel, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, these pages shall show. Here we have him imagining himself. And then finally, a nice little touch of alliteration. I dream of dragons, dreaming dragons. All right, let's look at a pretty significant piece of set building. So this is the first time that we really see Dickens develop London as a character. We've seen some Dickensian sets already. Nothing, though, compares to the way that Dickens can write London, especially dark, filthy London. Murdstone and Grinby's warehouse was at the waterside. It was down in Blackfriars. Modern improvements have altered the place, but it was the last house at the bottom of a narrow street, curving downhill to the river, with some stairs at the end where people took boat. There was a crazy old house with a wharf of its own abutting on the water when the tide was in and on the mud when the tide was out, and literally overrun with rats. Its paneled rooms, discolored with the dirt and smoke of 100 years, I dare say. Its decaying floors and staircase, the squealing and scuffling of the old gray rats down in the cellars, and the dirt and rottenness of the place are things not of many years ago in my mind, but of the present instant. They are all before me, just as they were in the evil hour when I went among them for the first time with my trembling hand and Mr. Quinion's. So notice how Dickens is using this language of extremity, last, bottom, narrow, to kind of move the space of this warehouse into a distance while still being at the center of London. The double repetition of rats, literally overrun, old gray rats, that small detail, and then the discolored, decaying dirt. So dirt here is partially euphemistic, and it stands in for human waste. So what seems to be happening here is the cellars, like, depending on the kind of building you had, you didn't have indoor plumbing. So you would have kind of a few different ways that you could get rid of waste, from an outhouse to just like a hole to a pot. And it's called like night soil, but also gets called dirt. Dickens is kind of obsessed with this. In Our Mutual Friend, his last fully completed novel, we will have entire plot lines developed around the collection of these dirt piles. So also as an aside, if you've ever read Great Gatsby, the Valley of the Ashes with those huge dirt piles, that's the same way, shipping out Manhattan's waste. And so here, right, we have, this is like literally a place of excrement that's gathered. And young Copperfield has a pretty excremental time there. But just like notice what I'm interested in here is the kind of shift between how almost the act of smell and sight is affecting author Copperfield. And moving on. I have 3 mentions of empire here. Chapter 10. Young or old, Davy dear, as long as I'm alive and have this house over my head, said Peggotty, you shall find it as if I expected you here directly minute. I shall keep it every day, as I used to keep your own little room, my darling. And if you was to go to China, you might think of it as being kept the same all the time you were away. So at first, this reference to going to China might seem like it is like if you were to go to the end of the world. But in a lot of ways, at this time in 1850, it's not the end of the world anymore. It's part of commerce back and forth. So, and it's fairly likely that a young Londoner, a young British person, could just go to China as a businessman. In Dickens's novel Little Dorrit, we have the character of Clennam, who actually works in mercantilism between China and London. And then in chapter 11, we get a little bit about the Murdstone Murdstone warehouse. Murdstone and Grinby's trade was among a good many kinds of people, but an important branch of it was the supply of wines and spirits to certain packet ships. I forget now where they chiefly went, but I think there were some among them that made voyages both to the East and West Indies. So this is essentially the entire expanse of the empire that Murdstone and Grinby's has its whiny hands in. So if we look here at this map in blue, these are the West Indies, right? We have Guyana, we have the Caribbean, the Bahamas, and Cuba. And then the East Indies are your India, Indochina, Indonesia areas. So a last one, these lovely pineapples that show up are a product of empire as well. So this is chapter 11. We had half an hour, I think, for tea. When I had money enough, I used to get half a pint of ready-made coffee and a slice of bread and butter. When I had none, I used to look at a venison shop in Fleet Street. Or I have strolled at such a time as far as Covent Market and stared at the pineapples. So pineapples come from South America, the border between Paraguay and Brazil, and then they're cultivated elsewhere. But yet again, another way in which we see products of empire brought to London for the child of empire to view and appreciate, but not yet partake. So we have a historical allusion, one that actually Dickens loves. He'll use it all over the place in all of his writings, which is the gunpowder plot of 5 November 1605. Many of you might know this as referenced in V for Vendetta. Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be for God. Essentially, it was a group of Catholic protesters that were rising up to kill James I, the Protestant king, who had been like repressing Catholics. So it's a tale of rebellion and religious persecution. But the way in which we get it from young Copperfield's point of view is in reference to Mr. Barcus's miserliness. Then I found out that Mr. Barcus was something of a miser, or as Peggotty dutifully expressed it, was a little near, and kept a heap of money in a box under his bed, which he only pretended was full of coats and trousers. In this coffer, his riches hid themselves with such a tenacious modesty that the smallest installments could only be tempted out by artifice, so that Peggotty had to prepare a long and elaborate scheme, a very gunpowder plot for every Saturday's expenses. I imagine there's a little bit of anti-patriarchalism here as well, but essentially what we're getting is this comic parallel to Mr. Barcus and his box of money, parallel to the House of Lords and Parliament government itself in London history. So a way in which the actions of the lower class are comic miniatures of what happens to the ruling class. Well, we're introduced to one of the great Dickens characters in chapter 11, which is Mr. Micawber, and he is recognizable first and foremost by his voice. Yes, Dickens goes out of his way to talk about his bald head, but it is his voice that we hear and remember. I am said the stranger. Thank heaven, quite well. I have received a letter from Mr. Murdstone in which he mentions that he would desire me to receive into an apartment in the rear of my house, which is at present unoccupied and is, in short, to be let as a, in short, said the stranger with a smile and a burst of confidence, as a bedroom. The young beginner whom I have now the pleasure to, and the stranger waved his hand and settled his chin on a shirt collar. And then we learn his name, and he says, under the impression, said Mr. Micawber, that your peregrinations in this metropolis have not as yet been extensive, and that you might have some difficulty in penetrating the arcana of the modern Babylon in the direction of the city road. In short, said Mr. Micawber in another burst of confidence, that you might lose yourself. I shall be happy to call this evening and install you in the knowledge of the nearest way. I don't have anything really to point out here other than notice those in shorts, those interruptions of himself, and the highfalutin vocabulary, peregrinations, arcana of the modern Babylon, etc. Pay attention to Micawber's speech, his repetitions, and this idea of confidence versus not. Like, is his speech pattern itself almost a character and energy in this novel? All right, so one thing that you have to talk about when you're talking about chapter 11 is something called the autobiographical fragment. So Murdstone and Grinby's wine warehouse is closely modeled on a place called Warren's Blacking Factory, which is where Dickens himself had been put to work as a child. Nobody knew this except for Forster during Dickens's life. This was an utter secret, but a little bit before writing Copperfield, Dickens had actually started writing down his own autobiography, and we see that he uses chunks of that in the Copperfield narrative. This illustration is a later one made to represent this moment for John Forster's Life of Dickens, the first biography about Dickens, and the one that included this autobiographical fragment that the public then learned about for the first time when reading it. So if you notice here from Dickens's David Copperfield, chapter 11, I know that I lounged about the streets insufficiently and unsatisfactorily fed. I know that, but for the mercy of God, I might easily have been, for any care that was taken of me, a little robber or a little vagabond too. Yet I had some station at Murdstone and Grinby's too. And then from the autobiographical fragment, I know that I have lounged about the streets insufficiently and unsatisfactorily fed. I know that, but for the mercy of God, I might easily have been, for any care that was taken of me, a little robber or a little vagabond. But I held some station at the blacking warehouse too. So this is easily, you can find it on Project Gutenberg. It's also, if you have the Penguin, as an appendix. So you can read through and find all of these other echoes and parallels that are there, and ask yourselves, what other questions about autobiography does this then raise? I want to end, but this is my last textual passage on kind of the ideas of the anxieties of autobiography. So this is the last paragraph of chapter 11 before we move into chapter 12. As I walked to and fro between Suffolk and Blackfriars and lounged about at mealtimes in obscure streets, the stones of which may, for anything I know, be worn at this moment by my childish feet, I wonder how many of these people were wanting in the crowd that used to come filing before me in review again to the echo of Captain Hawkins' voice. When my thoughts go back now to that slow agony of my youth, I wonder how much of the histories I invented for such people hangs like a mist of fancy over well-remembered facts. When I tread the old ground, I do not wonder that I seem to see and pity going on before me, an innocent, romantic boy, making his imaginative world out of such strange experiences and sordid things. So here we see this anxiety of inventing stories for other people, inventing them for yourselves, living a life immersed in narrative. We have this idea of fancy and facts. How great is that divide, or how small? And then lastly, in terms of Dickensiana, this week was announced the decoding of the famous Tavistock letter, a letter known for 150 years with no idea of what it said because it was written in Dickens's privatized shorthand. What it seems to be about thanks to the work of the people at Dickens Code, is that in May of 1859, Dickens appealed to the publisher, a man named Delane of the Times, not to reject his advertisement for his new periodical all the year round. This fits into a whole other range of things that were happening in the late 50s, especially 58, 59, 60. But here we finally seem to know. And what it seems to be is Dickens actually wrote a normal, quote unquote, letter in normal script, but then he kept this as a shorthand so that he would know what it said. So there's a number of shorthand holdings that are held in the Free Library of Philadelphia. So we hope this is just the start of maybe a new parade of texts to come to us. So with that, we will move forward into installment 5 for next week.